Everyone thought I was going to explode. That's what people expect, I guess. That kind of anger. That kind of scene. The shouting, the accusations, the dramatic ending where someone finally gets what they deserve. But when it happened, when I knew something was wrong, I didn't feel explosive. I felt tired. I remember standing in the middle of my own living space, looking around at things that were still technically mine. The same couch. The same dishes in the sink. The same faint hum of the refrigerator. Nothing had changed on the outside. But something essential was gone. It's strange how betrayal doesn't always arrive like a storm. Sometimes it shows up like a quiet absence. Like an ordinary morning that suddenly feels unfamiliar. Like you're standing in a life you recognize, but you don't belong in it anymore. There was a time when coming home felt safe. Now, it just felt staged. Like I was playing a role I hadn't agreed to audition for. I didn't know what I was yet. A partner? A fool? A placeholder? I only knew I wasn't who I thought I was. People assume you find out through a confrontation. A confession. A moment where someone breaks down and admits everything. That wasn't how it happened for me. It started smaller than that. Something so minor I almost ignored it. I didn't even have proof. Not then. Just discomfort. It was the kind of moment you could explain away if you wanted to. The kind of thing that, on paper, would sound ridiculous. A pause before answering a question. A phone turned slightly away. A laugh that didn't reach the eyes. Nothing that would hold up in an argument. Nothing you could point to and say, this is it. But I felt it. That shift. The first crack in something I didn't realize I'd been leaning on. I remember thinking, for a second, maybe I was just being paranoid. Maybe I was tired. Maybe stress was making me see things that weren't there. I wanted it to be nothing. Because noticing is a kind of line you cross. Once you start noticing, you can't unnotice. Suspicion changes the air in a room. It changes the way silence sounds. It changes the way you look at someone you love and wonder what parts of them you've never really met. At the time, I didn't even call it betrayal. Not yet. It was just wrongness. A feeling that something had moved, slightly, out of place. And I kept telling myself that relationships go through phases. People get distant. Life gets busy. I tried to be reasonable. I tried to be normal. But the discomfort stayed. It grew slowly, like a bruise you don't remember getting. And then, eventually, I reached the point where I understood something without anyone saying it out loud. The life I thought I had wasn't what I thought it was. The trust one lived inside of had already been broken somewhere behind my back. And suddenly, everyone had an opinion about what I should do. Friends talked about exposure. Family talked about revenge. People wanted fireworks. They wanted justice that looked loud. But all I could think was, if I did that, she would still be in my life. Even as an enemy. Even as a story. And I didn't want that. I didn't want her to take up any more space than she already had. So instead of planning a confrontation, I started planning an exit. Quietly. Carefully. Like someone walking out of a burning building without wanting to wake anyone up. If you've ever been in a situation where trust collapses without warning, you'll understand how heavy silence can be. And if you want to hear how I disappeared from a life that was already breaking, make sure you subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share it with someone who believes strength doesn't always have to be loud. Because the moment I stopped looking for revenge was the moment everything truly began to change. When I think back to the beginning, nothing about us felt fragile. That's the part that still confuses me. We didn't start with fireworks or chaos. There was no dramatic chase, no grand gestures. It was simple. Comfortable. The kind of connection that builds slowly and feels reliable because of it. We fell into routines almost without noticing. Morning coffee in the same 2 mugs. Groceries every weekend. A shared calendar on the fridge with small notes scribbled in the margins. I used to think that kind of ordinary rhythm meant stability. Like repetition itself was proof of commitment. We weren't reckless with each other. At least, I didn't think we were. We talked about practical things early on. Bills. Savings. What the next few years might look like. Not in a heavy way, just casually, like 2 people assuming they'd still be around for those conversations later. And I assumed that meant something. I was the planner between us. I liked structure. I liked knowing where things were headed. She liked flexibility. She used to say, "You think 5 steps ahead. I'm just trying to get through today." At the time, I thought that balance worked. If she was impulsive, I steadied things. If I was rigid, she softened the edges. That's how I framed it, anyway. Looking back, I can see how often I adjusted first. If she was tired, I handled dinner. If she forgot something, I covered for it. If she needed space, I gave it without asking too many questions. None of it felt like sacrifice back then. It felt like partnership. Like that's what you do when you care about someone. Our lives gradually intertwined in ways that made separation feel almost impossible. We shared expenses. We shared keys. We shared passwords at one point, though that stopped later and I didn't question it. We had mutual friends who stopped inviting us separately because we were just understood to be a unit. It wasn't dramatic. It was seamless. That's what made it dangerous. There's a certain safety in believing someone is predictable. In believing you know how they'll react, what they'll say, where they'll be at the end of the day. I believed that about her. I believed that if something was wrong, she would tell me. And she believed, I think, that I would always stay steady. That I wouldn't overreact. That I would choose understanding first. Maybe that was the imbalance. She trusted me to absorb things. I trusted her not to give me anything I'd need to absorb. We rarely fought in the early years. When we disagreed, it was short. A little tense, maybe, but it would end with one of us saying, "It's not worth it," and the other nodding. I thought that meant we were mature. Now I wonder if it meant we were avoiding something. There were small moments where I noticed she held parts of herself back. Certain friendships she kept separate. Certain stories that felt edited. If I asked about them, she'd shrug. "It's nothing. You're overthinking." And I would drop it. Because I didn't want to be the suspicious one. I didn't want to be controlling. I told myself trust meant not needing full access to everything. So I practiced that kind of trust. Blind in places. Deliberate in others. I defended her when people made casual comments about her being distant sometimes. "She just needs space," I'd say. That's how she is. I thought loving someone meant accepting their patterns without demanding explanations. And for a long time, that felt true. We built plans. Loose ones, but still plans. Trips we might take. Changes we might make. A future that stretched forward like it had already been agreed upon. I attached myself to that future quietly. I didn't even notice how much of my identity had started to wrap around us instead of me. When people asked about my goals, I answered in plural. "We're thinking about." "We might." "I'll see what she wants." It didn't feel like losing myself. It felt like building something bigger. And that's why the first crack didn't register as danger. Because when you believe in the foundation, you don't question the floor beneath your feet. You assume it will hold. I did. Until the day it didn't feel solid anymore. By the time we reached the middle of our relationship, it wasn't just love anymore. It was structure. That's the word I keep coming back to. We weren't two separate lives spending time together. We were a shared system. Our days fit into each other without effort. Her schedule shaped mine. My habits shaped hers. We made decisions automatically with the other person in mind. And I thought that was what commitment was supposed to feel like. There were little sacrifices that didn't look like sacrifices at first. I stopped seeing certain friends as often because weekends became our time. I passed on opportunities that would have meant traveling more, because she didn't like being alone for long stretches. I adjusted my routines, my pace, even my moods, to match what felt easiest for us. I told myself it was normal. That relationships require compromise. And they do. But compromise can quietly turn into something else when only one person is always bending. She wasn't cruel. That's important. She wasn't some obvious villain. Most of the time she was warm. Funny. The kind of person who could make strangers feel comfortable in minutes. She remembered birthdays. She'd bring home small things from the store because she thought of me. Those gestures mattered. They kept me grounded in the belief that we were solid. So when something felt off, I didn't panic. I corrected. I tried harder. If she seemed distant, I became more attentive. If she seemed distracted, I gave her space. If she pulled away emotionally, I leaned in with patience. It became a pattern I didn't name at the time. I was always the one smoothing the surface. I didn't think of it as dependency. I thought of it as love. But the truth is, somewhere along the way, I started needing the relationship to stay intact more than I needed to be honest about what I felt. That's hard to admit. I liked being the stable one. The reliable one. The person she could count on. It gave me purpose. And I think she came to expect it. There were moments when she'd cancel plans last minute, saying she was exhausted or overwhelmed. I'd say, of course, don't worry. There were times she'd disappear into her phone for long stretches, smiling at something I couldn't see. I'd glance over, then look away, telling myself it wasn't my business. There were questions I didn't ask because I didn't want to seem insecure. That's how attachment deepens sometimes. Not through romance. Through avoidance. Through the quiet agreement that certain things won't be examined too closely. Our social world became intertwined in a way that made everything feel permanent. Friends stopped checking in with me separately. Family asked about her before they asked about me. Invitations came addressed to both of us. Even the way people spoke to us changed. You two are good, they'd say. You've got something real. And I believed them. I believed it because I wanted to. Because once you build your life around someone, doubt becomes dangerous. Doubt threatens the whole structure. And I didn't want the structure to fall. There was also a kind of emotional imbalance that I didn't fully see until later. I was always trying to understand her internal world. Her stress. Her moods. Her silences. I made room for all of it. But she didn't always seem curious about mine. If I was quiet, she assumed I was fine. If I was overwhelmed, she'd say, "You'll figure it out. You always do." It wasn't dismissive exactly. It was expectation. Like my steadiness was part of the furniture. Something reliable in the background. And I played that role willingly. Because being needed felt better than being uncertain. I didn't realize how much I was anchoring myself to her approval, her comfort, her presence. I didn't realize how much leaving would eventually feel like tearing off part of my own skin. At the time, I thought we were growing stronger. That the merging meant security. I couldn't see that dependency can look a lot like devotion when you're inside it. And by the time the unease started creeping in, I was already too emotionally invested to recognize it as a warning. I just thought it was a phase. Something we'd get through. I didn't yet understand that some phases are the beginning of the end. It didn't start with anything dramatic. No late-night disappearance. No obvious lie I could point to. It was smaller than that. Almost forgettable. She began keeping her phone face down on the table. That was new, but not suspicious enough to comment on. When I asked who she was texting once, she said, "Just work stuff," and changed the subject. I told myself I was being intrusive for even noticing. There were longer pauses before she answered simple questions. "How was your day?" "Fine." A beat too long before the word came out. At first, I thought she was just tired. Everyone gets tired. Everyone drifts a little sometimes. But the drift didn't correct itself. It widened. She started taking calls in the other room. Not every time. Just enough that it registered. If I walked in unexpectedly, she'd say, "Hold on," into the phone and step outside. I'd stand there, feeling like I had interrupted something I wasn't supposed to hear. When she came back, I wouldn't ask. Because asking meant admitting I felt uneasy. And I didn't want to be that person. There's a kind of pride in being the secure one. I wore it like armor. If she came home late, she had a reason. Traffic. A last-minute errand. Someone needed help with something. All of it plausible. All of it reasonable. It's amazing how much you can rationalize when you don't want your life to change. The emotional distance was harder to explain away. She used to reach for me automatically. Small touches when passing by. A hand on my shoulder while I was cooking. Sitting close enough that our legs brushed on the couch. That stopped. Not all at once. Just less. If I leaned in, she'd respond. But she didn't initiate the way she used to. I remember one night I asked, "Are we okay?" She didn't look up right away. "Of course we are," she said. "Why wouldn't we be?" I shrugged. "You just feel far lately." She sighed, like I'd accused her of something unfair. "I've just been stressed. Not everything is about us." That sentence stayed with me. Not everything is about us. It sounded reasonable. Mature, even. But something about the tone made it feel like a door had quietly closed. I started noticing patterns after that. Her laughter at her phone. The way she angled the screen slightly away from me. The sudden need for more privacy in places that had always been shared. Passwords changed without discussion. When I asked about it casually, she said, "I just like having my own space." And I nodded. Because that's what a trusting partner does, right? They respect boundaries. They don't demand proof of loyalty. But respect and avoidance can look very similar from the outside. There was one moment that shouldn't have mattered. It was so small I almost feel embarrassed describing it. She was in the kitchen, texting. I walked in and said something light, something forgettable. She didn't hear me. She was smiling down at the screen in a way I hadn't seen in months. Not the polite smile she gave me when I tried to be funny. Something softer. Private. When she noticed me standing there, the smile disappeared almost instantly. "What?" she asked. "Nothing," I said. And that was it. No confrontation. No accusation. Just a shift. That was the first time my stomach dropped. Not because I had proof. But because I felt replaced in a way I couldn't articulate. After that, every small inconsistency felt heavier. I started replaying conversations in my head. Noticing gaps. Noticing stories that didn't line up perfectly. Still, nothing definitive. Just enough to make sleep harder. Just enough to make me question whether I was losing my mind. I told myself I was overthinking. I told myself trust means not investigating. But the truth is, once doubt enters, it rewrites everything. Even the silence changes. It no longer feels peaceful. It feels like something being hidden inside it. And I realized, slowly and without wanting to admit it, that I wasn't just imagining distance anymore. I was standing inside it. And I didn't know how much further it went. The truth didn't arrive with fireworks. There was no moment where she sat me down, trembling, ready to confess everything. There was no dramatic scene where I demanded answers and she broke under the pressure. It was quieter than that. And somehow, that made it worse. Because quiet leaves room for your mind to fill in the spaces. I don't even remember the exact second it clicked. I just remember the feeling of something inside me going cold. Like the part of me that still believed in us, just stopped moving. It wasn't one piece of evidence. It wasn't a single undeniable discovery. It was accumulation. Too many pauses. Too many deflections. Too many things that didn't make sense unless you stopped forcing them to. I remember sitting alone, staring at nothing, realizing that I had been spending weeks trying to convince myself I was safe. And that people who are safe don't have to do that. At some point, the discomfort became certainty. Not the kind you can argue in court. The kind you feel in your bones. I understood that something had been happening outside of me. Something I wasn't meant to see. And once I let myself accept that, everything rewrote itself. Her distance wasn't stress. Her privacy wasn't independence. Her missing warmth wasn't a phase. It was absence. It was diversion. It was the slow relocation of her attention somewhere else. I didn't confront her right away. That might sound strange to some people. But confrontation requires hope. It requires believing there's something to salvage, something to explain, something that will make it hurt less if you hear it out loud. I didn't want explanations. I didn't want details. I didn't want to sit across from someone and watch them try to reshape the truth into something softer. I already knew enough. The real rupture wasn't learning what happened. It was realizing what had already been taken from me before I even had the chance to respond. Trust doesn't break when someone admits something. It breaks when you realize you were living inside a version of reality that wasn't real. And that you were the only one who didn't know. When I finally looked at her, really looked at her, I saw someone familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. The person I loved was still standing there. But the relationship I thought we had was gone. I could feel it. It was like reaching for something in the dark and realizing it isn't there anymore. I did eventually let her see that I knew. Not through yelling. Not through accusations. Just stillness. She asked me one evening, "What's wrong with you lately?" And I surprised myself by answering honestly. "I don't think I'm in the same relationship you think I'm in." Her face changed. Just for a second. A flicker. Then she tried to steady it. "What does that mean?" I didn't push. I didn't list reasons. I didn't demand her phone. I just held her gaze. And in that silence, something passed between us that didn't need language. Her eyes filled quickly. That was confirmation enough. She started talking, fast and messy. It didn't mean anything. It was stupid. I don't know why I was just feeling. I barely heard the words. They felt distant, like sound underwater. All I could think was, everyone is going to want me to burn this down. I could already imagine the voices. My friends would say, expose her. My family would say, make him pay. People love revenge stories. They love clean justice. They love watching someone fight back. They don't love quiet endings. But as she cried and reached for me, apologizing in broken pieces, I realized something that shocked me. I wasn't angry in the way I expected. I wasn't full of rage. I was empty. I looked at her and felt the weight of how much energy it would take to hate her loudly. How much it would take to argue, to punish, to destroy. And I understood, with strange clarity, that revenge would still keep her close. Even if it was in bitterness. Even if it was in war. And I didn't want her close. Not as a partner. Not as an enemy. Not as a chapter one kept rereading. I wanted her gone from my life entirely. That was the moment the decision formed, not as a plan yet, but as a direction. I wasn't going to explode. I was going to disappear. And she still didn't understand that silence could be the beginning of an ending. Once the decision settled in, something inside me went very calm. Not peaceful. Just focused. She thought we were in damage control mode. That this was the part where we'd have long conversations, maybe cry, maybe negotiate new boundaries. She kept saying things like, "We can fix this," and "Tell me what you need." What I needed was already clear. Distance. I didn't announce it. I didn't threaten to leave. I just stopped reacting. When she apologized, I nodded. When she asked if I was okay, I said, "I'm thinking." Which was true. I was thinking about logistics. The first thing I did was separate money quietly. Nothing dramatic. I opened an account in my name only and moved what I could without triggering alarm. I told myself it was precautionary. That way, even if I changed my mind, I'd still have options. Options felt powerful. I started looking at apartments during lunch breaks. Small places. Temporary places. I didn't need perfect. I just needed independent. Every search felt surreal. Like I was planning someone else's life. At night, she tried to be closer than usual. Extra affectionate. Extra attentive. She'd reach for my hand more often, ask if I wanted to watch something together, sit closer than she had in months. It might have worked a year earlier. Now it felt like urgency. Like someone trying to hold water in their hands. I didn't reject her outright. I just didn't lean back in. That was harder than I expected. There's a habit to intimacy. Muscle memory. You forget how automatic it is until you try to stop. But every time I felt myself soften, I reminded myself of that cold realization. Of the weeks I spent doubting my own instincts. Of how easily I had been left outside of the truth. The lawyer came next. A quiet consultation. Nothing aggressive. Just information. What does separation look like? I asked. They spoke in neutral terms. Assets. Leases. Timelines. It felt transactional. I found comfort in that. Emotion had gotten me here. Structure would get me out. I started packing slowly. Not boxes stacked by the door. Just small removals. Important documents first. Then clothes I didn't wear often. Then things that mattered to me but wouldn't be immediately noticed. Each item felt symbolic. I wasn't just moving objects. I was detaching. She sensed something shifting. One evening she said, "You're different. Distant." I met her eyes. I think I've been distant for a while. I just didn't realize it. She looked confused. Hurt. Maybe even scared. "Are you leaving?" she asked. It was the first time she said it directly. I paused. "I'm deciding what staying would cost me." That was the closest I came to confrontation. There were no shouting matches. No broken plates. No dramatic ultimatums. Just quiet. The kind of quiet that stretches until someone breaks. She tried again and again to pull us back into familiar patterns. Suggested counseling. Suggested a weekend away. Suggested we reset. But resetting requires trust. And trust doesn't rebuild just because someone regrets breaking it. The day I finalized the apartment, I felt something unexpected. Not triumph. Not relief. Grief. Walking away didn't feel strong. It felt like losing. Losing the future I'd already imagined. Losing the version of myself that believed we were unshakable. But I kept moving. On the day I chose, I waited until she was at work. I packed the last of my things. Left behind what wasn't worth carrying. Stood in the doorway longer than I expected. The space looked the same. But I didn't belong to it anymore. I didn't leave a speech. Just a short note. I know. I'm gone. And for the first time in months, the silence felt like mine. The first few days after I left didn't feel real. I kept expecting my phone to ring non-stop, or for anger to come rushing in late, like my body had delayed the reaction. But mostly, there was just a strange emptiness. She did call. At first, it was frantic. Please answer. Where are you? Can we talk? Then the messages shifted into guilt. I'm sorry. I didn't think you'd actually leave. As if leaving was the part that shocked her most. Friends found out quickly. Not because I announced anything, but because absence is loud in shared circles. People started reaching out. Some were supportive. Some were confused. A few were almost disappointed, like I hadn't given them the dramatic ending they expected. My brother called and said, "You're just going to let it go?" I remember staring at the wall while he talked. "I'm not letting it go," I said. "I'm letting it end." He didn't understand that difference. Neither did my parents, at first. They wanted justice. They wanted consequences. They wanted something that looked like balance. But I wasn't interested in balance. I was interested in peace. The hardest part wasn't her reaction. It was the way people wanted me to perform pain in a way they recognized. Like heartbreak only counts if it's loud. There were moments I questioned myself. Late nights in a half-empty apartment, sitting on the floor because I hadn't bought furniture yet. I'd think, did I leave too quietly? Did I owe myself more anger? But then I'd remember what it felt like living inside suspicion. The constant second-guessing. The slow erosion of self-trust. And I knew staying would have cost more than leaving ever could. Weeks passed. The intensity faded. Not the sadness, exactly. But the urgency. Distance did something important. It gave me perspective. I started to see that my silence wasn't weakness. It was refusal. Refusal to beg for honesty. Refusal to compete for loyalty. Refusal to remain in a place where trust had already been broken behind my back. People eventually stopped asking for details. The world moved on, like it always does. But inside me, something steadied. If you've ever chosen peace over revenge, if you've ever walked away without getting the closure you thought you deserved, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Subscribe to the channel, like this video, and comment below with what you would have done. Because sometimes the fallout isn't an explosion. Sometimes it's just the quiet realization that leaving was the first honest thing you'd done for yourself in a long time. I used to think strength looked like confrontation. Like standing your ground, demanding answers, making sure the other person understood exactly what they'd done. I thought walking away quietly meant you didn't care enough. Now I see it differently. What happened didn't just break my trust in her. It broke something in the way I understood my own life. For a while, I kept replaying everything, wondering where the shift really started, wondering how long I'd been the only one still fully inside the relationship. But eventually, I realized that those questions didn't have clean answers. And even if they did, they wouldn't change what was already gone. Leaving didn't feel powerful in the moment. It felt like grief. It felt like carrying a version of the future out to the curb and admitting it wasn't coming back inside. But distance has a way of clarifying things. I didn't leave to punish her. I left because staying would have meant shrinking myself into someone who accepts half-truths just to avoid being alone. I left because revenge would have kept me emotionally tethered to the same damage. I didn't want to live in bitterness. I wanted to live in honesty. Closure didn't come with a dramatic apology or a perfect explanation. It came slowly, in the quiet mornings where I realized I could breathe again. In the ordinary moments that started to feel like mine. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do isn't making someone hurt the way you hurt. Sometimes it's refusing to keep hurting yourself just to prove a point. So I'll leave this with a question I still think about. When trust is broken, is justice about destruction? Or is it about walking away before you become someone you don't recognize?